All right, so this is a submission from one of my readers named Michael, and he said, I've designed this patient health dashboard, and all in all, it looks pretty good. It's not like just obviously awful, and there's so many little things we need to fix. So what we want to do is like try and take it to the next level, and I'm going to talk about some design strategies for that. Where let's take something that again, it already looks pretty modern, pretty neat and clean. And then how do we just make it look even better than that? So first thing I'm going to do is, pardon me, I've got a little bit of a lingering cough here. Oh, the first thing I'm going to do is realize my Bluetooth keyboard's not working. So I'm going to press A and create a new frame where we're going to be doing all the new design work. And actually, one other thing I'll do is just for posterity's sake, we'll keep an original example here, and then I'll start modifying this one a little bit. So one of the things with designing a dashboard is a dashboard, almost by definition, has so much information on it, more information than almost any other kind of design you're going to be working on. And these are also super practical to understand how to design as, say, a freelance designer or even a full-time designer somewhere, because just an outsized proportion of the businesses that want to hire designers have things like dashboards or data heavy like tables or screens like that. It's just something that as a designer, if you're going to get good at UI design, you have to understand how to do this. So when I'm designing a dashboard, one thing I think about is three questions actually that I ask myself is what can I remove, what can I hide, and what can I sort of lighten or make less visibly obvious or less visibly apparent. So with those three things, I can treat a whole bunch of the elements on this page, and it's going to go a long ways towards making it cleaner. So we're just going to kind of do a little bit of that at the beginning. It's actually going to make, to some degree, it's going to make things a little bit messier before it gets better, but you'll kind of see how this works. So one thing I might do is delete something like this welcome message, which doesn't really serve a practical purpose in the dashboard. Like if we want to add it in later, we can always go and do that. But for right now, it's really big, it's really bold, it's at the top, and it's not providing a proportionate amount of value for users. This make an appointment button is kind of in a weird place. And actually, my first inclination would be that we should put it where the appointments are actually listed. And this is something I talk about in my user experience course called Learn UX Design, called the law of locality. Then we also have this little sentence saying when your last appointment was and that there's no upcoming appointments. But I also feel like this is sort of not super, super important because that should be pretty obvious if they look at appointments or recent visits to see when their last one is and if they have any upcoming. So I'm going to remove that as well. And that lets us remove this entire box at the top. Now, we are now at a point where all of this information, we could like slide it way on up here towards the top. But this looks a bit odd. And so actually what I want to do is work on this sidebar for a minute. Pardon me again. So with this sidebar, you'll notice that it's like the most colorful element on the screen, right? Like, yeah, there's this button and maybe there's a few hundred pixels of yellow color right here. But this sidebar is like at least as wide as the button, and then it's whatever, dozens of times taller. So if you kind of squint and you just ask yourself, what attracts my attention the most on this page? The answer is the sidebar. It's huge and it's colorful. But if you squint and you kind of are just trying to perceive the page at a very like high level, you should always perceive the most important element first. Whatever you squint and see first, that should be the most important thing that you want to draw users' eyes towards. And the sidebar doesn't really meet those criteria or that criterion. So what I want to do is make this sidebar a little bit less noticeable. So one way to do that is, actually this is maybe a bit incidental, but I'm going to have it go all the way from top to bottom. And then instead of it being this blue, this kind of dark, rich blue color, I'm actually just going to grab this light gray right here, which unfortunately makes all this stuff invisible just for a second. But actually, I can grab all these things, and then I'm just going to quickly try and recolor some of these sidebar items so that we can see them, and then we'll keep moving on to other stuff. I'll put like whatever, let's say we'll make it 70 pixels tall, and this will be sort of the highlighted state around the item that is currently selected. So I'll just make it this kind of a blue color, and then these items right here, I will give them a much darker version of this same blue so that they stand out. Now, just because we're on the sidebar, I'll talk about a few other things related to the sidebar. One is that I have this idea that you should always have your icons sort of be about the same thick. Oops, I think I just created a new file. It's not what I want to do here. About the same thickness as the text, as the like letter forms in the text. And so I call that being drawn with the same pen. In other words, it should look like this icon is about the same thickness as this text right next to it. And you don't want the icons to pop that much more or that much less than the text. Overall, they kind of should like add, as if they're like another letter form. Technically, like an icon is a picture, but it's one that sort of feels like a letter form might. So I'm going to take each of these icons and I'm actually going to shrink them just a bit and make them a little bit more sized, similar to the text. And if this was a real client project, this might be a little bit more careful of a process. For right now, all I'm going to do is I'm just, taking the height field and reducing that. And as long as the aspect ratio is held the same, then it'll be great. Like it'll work just fine. And then here's the last one. Do the same thing. Okay. Now, one thing I want to be careful of is basically as the user moves their mouse down from one link to the next, there basically should be no quote unquote dead space where I'm not hovering over a link, which means that each of these pieces of text is essentially like they're just it's a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is that 6 or 7 contiguous links. So what I'm going to do is actually I can tell Figma to tidy up the spacing and then I can reduce it wholesale and kind of get all of them at once. Something like that looks a lot better. And then I just need to adjust the icons so that they're that same distance apart. There we go, something like that. Then I might move them over. I'm going to reduce this blue a little bit and end up with a sidebar that overall is not like competing with the rest of the screen quite so much. All right, now I have these other things, which I'm going to move down just a bit. And at this point, I can continue going through and kind of deleting the things that I think are unnecessary. And that's just part of it. Like I said, there's 3 things I'm really doing. I'm saying, one, is there stuff that's totally unnecessary that I can remove? Is there stuff that is currently too important or looks too important or eye-catching that I can reduce the visual weight of? And then is there stuff that's so infrequently used that I can hide it behind a menu or hide it so that I only see it on hover or something else like that? So for instance, these medical icons, they're not really adding any practical purpose, but they do kind of add something to the design. So I'll keep them, but maybe I would just make them smaller, like say 30 pixels instead of 40. And I'm just kind of eyeballing them. There's not really a strong reason to do any specific value here. Now, these little percentage changes, to me, these are actually kind of confusing because, for instance, I don't know when it's an 8% decrease compared to. If I'm at 155 now, I don't know when I was 8% more. Doesn't say that. And then also, this is a fixable issue, but in this particular design that was submitted, like having my heart rate go up doesn't seem to be a green, like green equals good. It doesn't seem to be a good thing. Meanwhile, say, for instance, my weight going down, that probably shouldn't be red. So I'm actually just going to remove those rather than try and fret about them too much. Already that gets things looking a bit cleaner, but we will still come back and do a bit more with this. So with the appointments here, unless I have just an incredible number of appointments scheduled, I don't think I really need the ability to sort by specialist, which is what this implies. Likewise, same thing with date and time. And then the status, if this was a real client project, I'd want to understand what all the statuses were and which ones we need to display here. But if I have a canceled appointment, I feel like it's pretty much just should not be appearing here. So I would actually say this needs to be either upcoming or I'm just going to remove it. And the same thing with delayed. Like I would want to understand how the system works in full, but I could imagine instead showing only the ones that were actually happening. And then here we go. Let's see. Show maybe canceled or whatever it is. This would be a link so I could see appointments of other statuses. Cool. Moving on to prescriptions, I want the prescriptions and the appointments to actually be nicely aligned with one another. And then these cards will also be the same way. But one thing I'm going to do is in the same manner that we have like little titles right here, I'm actually going to show them above this column too, because I want basically everything to look as consistent as possible. In my user interface design course, I call this consistency first, just the idea that like the more things look consistent, where similar items are styled similarly, the more users will just sort of have this understanding that they are looking at similar types of things. And so likewise, if this is sort of a table of appointments and this is a table of prescriptions, I'm going to have the same consistent style of header on both of those. So this is really like, I don't know, let's say the medicine, and then this is the instructions. There might be medical terms that are better for this, but that's like an easy fix. All right, and then I have the same sort of thing with these visits recent visits right here. But you know what? I'm not actually sure we're going to have too much time to get to this table, so I'll leave it be for now. All right. So just doing, I mean, this isn't a before after, this is like a before and then partway through, but you can see we've already cleaned up things quite a bit and really at no loss of functionality. Just to review, a lot of what we've been saying to ourselves is what can we remove or what can we make a little bit less visible? And so already I think this is in a better state, but there's still going to be other things that we can fix. So now what I'm going to do is actually take this dashboard and I'm going to fix one of the most common beginner design mistakes that I see, which is most of these design apps, when you create a new artboard or a new frame to start working from, they're going to give you this perfectly white background, and you can see this everywhere. So if you accept that white background and then you go and decide that you're going to make a card, for instance, maybe a card where you're displaying some specialist's name or some details about an appointment, you often think, okay, I need a slightly different color here, and you reach for something that's really similar to white. And since white is the brightest color, the only thing you can do is use a very light gray. Unfortunately, there's this weird effect where any color that's darker appears to actually be more recessed into the screen. And so if you want something to pop and feel like it's popping out like a card would if it's overlaid on the background of the screen, you actually want to use instead the brightest white for the card and then a slightly darker gray for the background. So one thing I'm going to do right here is grab this medium background white color and let's see, just switch it to white. Okay, so it looks like that's hitting most of the cards. I might want to dive into these ones special. Switch the background color. But then on the entire frame, I'm going to go and change the fill color to, instead of be white, I'm going to move the brightness down a bit. And if you notice, this is the hue, saturation, brightness color system that I'm using. I don't have a ton of time to talk about that, but if anyone has questions, they can ask it in the Q&A. We can talk about why I use that color system rather than something like RGB. I'm also just going to put a little divider line between the sidebar and the main area, because now they're both these shades of gray. This one is they're both very, very bright gray. But one thing I want to do, and this is another very common beginner designer mistake, is I don't actually want the divider line to be this dark. Like if you look, that's actually, it's ridiculously dark. And so this kind of goes to what we were talking about, where everything Like I want to look at every element, and that includes things like divider lines, and say what is too eye-catching relative to its importance. And this divider line, all it needs to do is sort of signal that there's a division of content between the left side and the right side. And it's a very simple job. And as long as it's subtle enough or visible enough that it kind of separates the content, it doesn't need to be any darker. So I just pressed 1 to make it 10% opacity. And that's actually plenty dark for something like this. You'll notice, by the way, that now all of these cards, oops, I mean to delete them. All of these cards now look a little bit more like true cards where they're kind of a white background on a light gray, on a sort of a greater light gray background. And that's just going to feel a little bit more accurate, a little bit more realistic. And most of the cards in professionally designed apps that you see are going to follow this same format. Oh, hey, someone's in the Figma file. One thing I'm actually going to do, Figma is cool because you can see everyone else who's here. Looks like it's maybe only one other person right now. But I'm going to go ahead and turn off multiplayer cursors just so we don't have other people's cursors flying around here. Now, this one thing I want to talk about that's super important, apart from just kind of these like heuristics for how to simplify dashboard UI. So I want to talk a little bit about brand, because brand is very important if you're designing UI. Brand is the idea that you might have a series of adjectives that just represent how you want users to feel about your site or app. And they could range everything from, say, very friendly to professional to artsy to quirky to scientific or futuristic, etc. So when Michael submitted this design, one thing he mentioned is it should just have like a very simple professional brand. And honestly, with most client work today, that's the most common request that you're going to get is people just want something that looks clean and simple and neat. And especially for something that's medical, it's going to be like a pretty plain, simple brand. We're not really going to do too much with it. It just needs to sort of convey professionalism and that it's modern and it's neat. So one of the big ways that you convey brand is with the choice of font that you have. And so I'm going to actually select everything on this whole frame, and I'm going to change the font. I'm going to change it from, it's currently in a font called Open Sans, to something that is like a little bit more just neat and clean feeling. Now, one of the resources, pardon me, one of the resources that I have in my Learn UI Design course for all students is a Figma document called the Good Fonts Table. And this is over 100 handpicked fonts that I've compiled, sans serif, serif, slab serifs, and other. And this is a resource that all students have lifetime access to. And one thing I've done is, beyond just doing the normal classification of fonts, which you don't really need to worry about now, like things like grotesque or Gothic sans, I've went and found some of them that are, for instance, labeled or feel very clean and simple, as opposed to, say, ones that feel quirky and friendly, or ones that feel kind of techy or condensed. There's all sorts of different feelings that I've kind of identified. And this makes it easy to go pick whatever one you might want. So for instance, I just happen to know, and we can go into this in more detail, that I'm going to want a clean, simple font here, and I might pick one from this list. And Inter is actually a very popular new font that I'm going to use for this example. So I have everything selected. I think if I press plus, okay, now it just styled all text the exact same way. Whatever, we might just have to live with it. Yeah, so that fixed a lot of it, but some of the things that were in child elements of groups are still going to take a little bit more styling. So let's just swing through some of this stuff fairly quickly. One thing I'll do here is I'm going to left align all of this text. And then in the same way that I highlighted with color the active state here, I'm actually going to de-emphasize all the other non-active ones. And a great way to do that is just by setting the opacity lower. So now the icons are at 70% opacity, the text is at 80, and that actually feels pretty nice. If I have a logo in the same font, I might do something like give it the black weight, which is just the absolute thickest font weight. It's like even bolder than bold. I'll pump up the size a little bit. And just doing something like this will make it a little bit more distinguishable from the rest of the content on this page. Now what I can do, actually, it's kind of funny. Even though I lost all of this styling, it sort of helps in a way because now I can keep things very, very consistent. I can select all similar items at the same time. So what I'm doing here is just making sure that all the text is nice and aligned. Make sure that everything is also aligned left. And then I'm going to make these particular stats bigger. Say something like size 24. It looks like they lost the fact that they should be an enter. So I'll get that. For medical, these little subtitles here, those lost their styling as well, unfortunately. So I'll do, by default, I'm just going to try the same font size that I'm using here. And again, that's just what I call consistency first, just defaulting towards making things consistent and then only making them less consistent if there's a specific reason to do so. So these are all like little labels, right? These 6 things that I have selected here. And I'm actually going to go ahead all the other labels that I have because like medicine, instructions, etc. These are basically the label for the column label below. So I'm going to style all of these things the same. I'm making them all enter, and I'm actually a little bit smaller. Oops, no, first what I really want to do is make them all left. Then I'll make them smaller. I'm actually going to use a hotkey to make them all uppercase. And then I'm going to press 8 or 7 to make them a little bit lighter. And this combination of text styles, making it smaller and uppercase and lighter, is something that professional designers do to a great degree. And I this in Learn UI Design. It's a really handy go-to. I call it the pattern: smaller, lighter, uppercase, and bold. I'm going to reduce the spacing on this button because that seems to be a bit too much right now. And then one thing I'm going to do is make the button into a color that actually looks good with the blue. So in theory, I could just steal this little blue color right here, but that doesn't really pop as much now, right? Like there's plenty of other blue stuff on the page, and this button to make a new appointment might be one of the most important buttons on the page. So I want it to be a little bit more easy to see. So one way to do that is, hold on one second. I'm actually just styling this button bolder, and in some ways it's now more similar to the label style. And I'll just remove the border here, and I'll make it a bit taller, which it feels like I could use that. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so I don't want to do this blue color. Instead, what I might do is pair the cool blue with a warmer accent color. And that's one of the things that I recommend in Learn UI Design. The very best color that you can pair with a cool color, like say blue or purple, is almost certainly going to be a warm color, like maybe something that's kind of like a golden, just like a yellowish, orangish golden color. It's like a good thing to explore. So yeah, maybe something like that. And then a bunch of these pieces of text here did not seem to get selected. So I need to go select all of these. And again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to change them to enter, regular, 16, left aligned. This should be much better. Yeah, now just for the sake of this example, I don't actually think we're going to get to this table below. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. We'll have more than enough to cover just with this stuff. But in a real design, obviously, we wouldn't be able to get away with that. One thing I'll do here is I'll bold the doctor's name because I feel like that's one of the more important parts of the appointment. Is you've got the date, the time, and then you want to be able to see who you're actually seeing. And I'll move this down a bit too. Now I made the backgrounds of these cards white here, but I'm actually going to go and select all the cards themselves. And right now they have a very wide border radius. Like you'll notice, it's actually, if I select this, it says it has a 20 pixel border radius. And what I want to do is actually have a much smaller border radius. The wider your border radius is, the more it just feels like you kind of have a soft, friendly vibe going on. Whereas if you had, say, if I had no border radius at all, that means it's perfectly square. And so if all these cards are perfectly square, that feels like kind of official and succinct and tight. But I want just the slightest hint of friendliness. So I'm going to do 2 pixels. And it looks like I need to remove a border there and here. Nice. That's better. And then looks like I also have some borders right here. I'm going to increase the brightness of them. And then I'm going to see if I can apply them on these 2 cards. Yeah, they're... Oh, this is a bit wonky. 1 second. Because this is someone else's file, there's just like something is happening. Oh, yeah, there we go. The layers are just not acting exactly how I expect them to because of how we set up the file. But this idea that everything has like a little 2 pixel border radius and that's it, I can apply that to everything. Like I can apply that to the buttons. I applied it to the cards. And again, my goal is just to be consistent about as much stuff as possible, like to have everything default to consistency and only be inconsistent if it's truly different. So to those ends, I'm also going to take this content up here and I'm going to put that same style card behind everything, just like, this right here. Now in an actual design, I would be positioning these a little bit more closely. Maybe I'd make sure they were spaced exactly evenly, but for the purposes of today, this is good enough. Get some stuff out there. Now pull in the spacing here so that there's a very clear divide between the appointments on the left-hand side and the prescriptions on the right-hand side. What I don't want is for these cards to be so long that a user somehow sees the first prescription as being related to the first appointment. Like that's not true. That's sort of a false parallelism. And so I just want to make sure there's enough spacing so that they are perceived as 2 separate lists. And likewise, just as I highlighted the doctor's name, I'm also going to make sure that the name of the medication is highlighted as well. Looks like these are a bit wonky. Yeah, so I'll grab all of these, line them left. And then I'll bold these, bring them down just a bit. And this can be centered within the card. Cool. All right. And now, again, just for the sake of consistency, one other thing I might do is just as these cards all have sort of a subtle border around them, I might add in a stroke on the outside of this button, but rather than having the black be 100% opacity, I might give it something like a 10% opacity so that it blends in with the yellow behind it. And it's just one of those other things where now the card and the button, all the cards and all the buttons on the whole page are consistent, not only in the border radius, but in the border style. So at this point, now we can do like a little bit more detailed of a before and after. And we basically use just a few general principles here. And I break it up into 2 sections. One is sort of the fundamental stuff that we did just about simplifying the UI, saying, what can we remove? What can we just delete wholesale? What can we really de-emphasize or lighten or reduce the importance of? And then what stuff can we hide behind a menu? In that latter category, by the way, that's good for things like this download PDF button. If very few users download a PDF and yet you still need the functionality, that might be the perfect sort of thing to put in a menu of like other actions or something like that. Of course, we didn't get here in this like very brief redesign, but that's just an example. Anyhow, so we asked ourselves those three questions. And then the other half of the stuff we focused on was really about brand, and in particular typography. And we switched from Open Sans, which is it's what's called a humanist font, and it has like a lot of little details that are sort of reminiscent of human handwriting. Even though it looks like a computer font, like it's ultimately its base is in human handwriting. And we actually switched to a different font that in many ways is a little more crisp and neat and clean feeling, which seems like applicable for this medical application. Actually, just one quick example of that is if you look at a character like the E or the C, you'll notice the terminals, that's the end of the letter forms right here, are parallel with each other. It's a small detail, but it kind of makes the font feel a little bit more crisp and put together to have that parallel, those parallel lines, even within a letter form like that. If we go and look at the original font, Open Sans, you'll see that there's no sense of parallelism. It's literally open, right? Because these terminals don't come in and form parallel lines. There's just a lot more open space right here. So we didn't want something that was quite as open and friendly feeling. We wanted something that felt a little bit more crisp and professional. And I would say that this works perfectly for this sort of application. And then another big thing to consider with brand is color, and then and imagery is another one. But with the color, I mean, we talked briefly about having an accent that's warm to complement the brand color, which is cool. And then with the imagery, there's almost none on this page. But one thing I would think about if we had more time is perhaps, these are circular, and we took these very round cards and made them much more squared off. I would do the same thing with these images right here.